Welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 1 material. Chapter 1 is titled Basic Considerations, and the first topic we'll talk about are the fundamental difference between solid, liquids, and gases. Then we'll talk about how we define pressure and how we scale it. The major section of material in the chapter deals with fluid properties, and then we'll close off by having a brief discussion about the ideal gas law. The image you see to the left of the slide here is what happens when a raindrop hits the surface of a water body like the lake or the ocean. It creates this depression up at the top here. Let's select the pen so that we can actually write on the slide here. Good. So the water droplet is coming down like this, and the depression created in the free surface is like this. So above the image you can think of that's the atmosphere, and below it this is water here, but these features here are actually air bubbles or air cavities. So when a raindrop hits the surface of a lake or ocean, it entrains some air and creates this very interesting flow and creates a number of air bubbles. This is a video that is showing an interesting fluid flow that I've studied for many years. So it's a fluid in motion, and the two fluids in motion are water and air. And this is what is referred to as a plunging breaking wave. So the wave is created in a laboratory wave flume. So think of a long rectangular channel that's filled with water to a depth of maybe 60, 70 centimeters. And at the end of the channel, you have a wall that you can control and move through a computer-controlled hydraulic system. So you move the wall in a certain way, and then a wave propagates down the channel, and it gets steeper and it breaks. So what's happening here is you're actually mixing two flows, so that you see air bubbles. You're mixing two fluids, I should say. So you're mixing water and air. Okay? Now, at the top of the screen, you see one possible definition of fluid mechanics, and it is the study of the behavior of liquids and gases at rest and in motion. So we're going to see that fluids can be either a liquid or a gas. That's the definition of a fluid. So we will study the motion of fluids, and we'll just study the behavior of fluids at rest, and we'll talk mainly about that in Chapter 2. So, solids, liquids, and gases. And of course, this is material you would have discussed in physics and chemistry a long time ago, but it's useful to remind ourselves of the differences here. Solids, of course, have densely spaced molecules, and they have large intermolecular forces, and they are not easily deformed. Okay? And so solids have a rigid lattice structure, and if we wanted to study fluid mechanics, I mean solid mechanics, we are studying fluid mechanics, but studying solid mechanics, the fundamental law is Hooke's law, and Hooke's law relates stress, stress and strain. In fact, Hooke's law says stress and strain are proportional or linearly related. Now, liquids have smaller intermolecular forces than solids, and they are easily deformed, but not easily compressed. Okay? And the molecules are free to move. So with liquids, they occupy, we could say, a constant volume, or at least approximately constant volume, unless we subject them to a very high pressure. And later in the chapter, we'll talk about the compressibility of liquids and how we quantify that. So if we know that the molecules in a liquid are free to move because when we fill a glass of water, the water moves and conforms to the container. So we could say that liquids conform to a container while maintaining a constant volume. Okay. Now gases have very small intermolecular forces. They are easily deformed and easily compressed. And the molecules are completely free to move, right? If we put gas into a closed container, it expands to fill the container. So what is a fluid? I've already said fluids can be a liquid or a gas. So one definition of a fluid is that it's a substance that deforms continuously when acted on by a shear stress of any magnitude. So this is a photograph of the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. A colleague of mine from the University of Washington has conducted a number of research studies studying deep water breaking waves or plunging breaking waves. So that wave right there was moving in this direction, and it's currently still breaking, but it had broken previously and left this big bubble plume behind. Okay, so it's creating a complicated flow that's even more complicated than the one you get when you create a plunging breaking wave in the laboratory, because the wave here has a more complicated shape. Anyway, my reason for showing you this picture is that waves are created on the ocean surface, and currents, some of the currents in the ocean are created through the action of wind. So if we think about the surface of the ocean, I'll just draw it as this wavy line, and the wind is blowing across the surface of the ocean. What is actually happening is the wind is applying a shear stress tau to the surface of the ocean, and that will create a current that actually varies with depth, something like this. So it's larger at the surface, and then it gets smaller as you go deeper. Okay. Now, when you create a current, the water is moving or continuously deforming. So even if you have a very light wind, in other words, a shear stress of a very small magnitude, you'll still get a very tiny current in the water. Okay, so this happens in oceans, lakes, and it even happens in rivers. But my point is that as long as you're applying that shear stress, the water will continue to move or be continuously deformed. Next, we'll talk about macroscopic versus microscopic behavior. Now, microscopic behavior is when we would consider the behavior of individual molecules. So we could say who or what fields of study are interested in the microscopic behavior of fluids. We could say, well, if I study physics or chemistry, I'm interested in the molecular behavior of substances, liquids, gases, solids. As engineers, though, we are typically not solving problems that require us to understand what individual molecules are doing. We're interested in the macroscopic behavior. So this is the behavior averaged over a small volume that still contains many molecules. So the volume can really be quite small. It turns out it can be a fraction of a millimeter cubed, because a millimeter cubed of a gas contains about 10 to the 18th molecules, and a millimeter cubed of liquid 10 to the 21. So you can see we'll still have billions and billions of molecules even in a very tiny volume. So we are going to be studying fluid mechanics in the context of continuum mechanics, just like we do in solid mechanics. In solid mechanics, this same argument applies, that when it comes to engineering work. We're not interested in typically in the behavior of individual molecules, but their macroscopic behavior. So let's talk a little bit about shear stress next. I already talked about how when the wind blows over the surface of the ocean, that moving fluid, the moving air, actually exerts a stress on the fluid below it, the water. So a shear stress, as you all know, is created when we have a tangential force acting on an area. So this little diagram illustrates it. So delta Ft is our tangential force, and it's acting tangential to the surface, and it's acting on this little differential area, delta A. So we could say in this case, our shear stress, which we will use the symbol tau for, is going to be the magnitude of that tangential force divided by the area. And if we want the stress at a point, we need to shrink that area in the limit to 0. Okay. So we said fluids will move under the action of a shear stress no matter how small in magnitude. Now, of course, the units of a shear stress will be force divided by area, and in the SI system that would be newtons per meter cubed or pascals. So pascals, and if we have a larger stress, kilopascal, and which of course is just 1,000 pascals. Pressure. So pressure is defined as a normal compressive force acting on an area. So again, a similar diagram here, but now we are concerned with the normal force. It's acting over our little differential area. And so the definition of pressure at a point is the magnitude of that little differential force acting on that differential or small area. And we have to shrink it to 0 if we want the pressure at a point. Okay, so this is pressure at a point. And it also has units of force divided by area. So that will be also newtons per square meter or pascals. For pressure, we often have large pressures, and we use kilo and megapascals. Okay. Now, in Civi 330, we won't be using the imperial system, but it's still, when we get out into the workforce, because we live next to the United States, who still uses the empirical system, it's useful to at least know a little bit about it. And the most common measure of pressure in the imperial system is pounds per square inch, so that's defined as pound force per inches squared. Now, you'll be happy to know that I won't be asking you to solve any problems using the imperial system, so we can just focus exclusively on the SI system. When you get out and you're doing engineering, perhaps you'll work on projects that are actually located in the United States, you'll have to become more familiar with the imperial system. We're going to talk about temperature scales, and the reason for doing this now is because it'll lead us into a discussion of pressure scales. So we know that temperature can be defined in an absolute scale. In the SI system, that's Kelvin. In the imperial system, it's Rankine. So in the absolute scale, there can be no negative pressure. There can be no negative temperatures. So absolute zero temperature defines the minimal energy that a substance, the state at which it has its minimal energy. The relative temperature scale that we use for the in the SI system is Celsius, of course, and in the imperial system it's Fahrenheit. So this is the temperature relative to the freezing point of water, right? Which of course, so 0 degrees Celsius equals 273.15 Kelvin. So that's the conversion way we convert between absolute and relative temperature. Most times we can just refer to the temperature in degrees Celsius, but for example, when we're using the ideal gas law, we have to use absolute temperatures. Pressure scales. There's also an absolute pressure scale and a relative pressure scale. So the absolute pressure scale, of course, is analogous to the Kelvin temperature scale. If there are no negative pressures and zero pressure will occur in a perfect vacuum, which would be out in outer space. Turns out you can't create a perfect vacuum on Earth because it's extremely difficult to remove all of the molecules of a gas from a container and or to limit sort of molecular leaks. So if we can't go below zero, so there's no negative pressures, similar to the Kelvin temperature scale. So now, gauge pressure is analogous to the Celsius scale because it is the relative pressure scale. And gauge pressures are measured or referenced to the atmospheric pressure. Okay? And they're called gauge pressures because the most commonly used pressure gauges measure the pressure relative to the atmospheric pressure. So if one of those little dial gauges you see that tell you the pressure, typically if it read 50 kilopascals, that would be telling you that the pressure that gauge, the pressure inside the container that gauge is attached to, is 50 kilopascals higher than atmospheric. Now, the relationship between absolute and gauge pressure is given here. Absolute pressure is equal to the sum of gauge pressure plus atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure varies. Its average value at sea level is about 101.3 kilopascals. In Edmonton, the average atmospheric pressure would be lower than that, maybe something like 90 kilopascals. Okay. As you go to higher elevation, the atmospheric pressure decreases, or, quote, the air gets thinner. Okay. Now, we know that absolute pressure has to be greater than or equal to zero. It cannot be negative. But gauge pressure can be negative. So this is just exactly analogous to Kelvin and Celsius. We can't have a negative Kelvin temperature, but of course we can have negative Celsius temperatures. Minus 20 degrees Celsius tells us the temperature is simply 20 degrees below the freezing point of water. So let's do an example. Let's say we have an absolute pressure of 70 kilopascal, and let's assume the atmospheric pressure is 101.3. So then the gauge pressure is the absolute minus the atmospheric. So it's minus 31.3 kilopascals. Negative pressures are sometimes referred to as vacuum pressure. So if somebody tells you there's a 31.3 kilopascal vacuum pressure, that's just another way of saying it's minus 31.3. If we have a gauge pressure of 150 kilopascals and the atmospheric pressure is the same, 101.3, then we would write that the absolute pressure is 251.3 kilopascals. So it's really straightforward to convert between the two. We will find out when we get into the discussion of fluid statics in Chapter 2 that most of the engineering problems that we're interested in can be solved using gauge pressure.